You may think this is outlandish, but hear me out. Traditional education is on the path to becoming obsolete, and maybe even Ivy League universities are following suit. In this conversation with Victor Davis, Jordan Peterson just pulled the lid on what's really going on inside the elite universities, backed up by his own decades-long experience teaching at some of North America's most prestigious institutes. But that's just scratching the surface, because there's a lot more we need to talk about after you watch this next clip.
The leftists who were pushing for equality of outcome insisted that if there were differences in socioeconomic outcome that you could identify by group, then that was a prior evidence of systemic oppression, let's say. But they fell astray of a certain peculiarity with regards to group identity, which is that group identity is actually infinitely fragmentable. And so when I walked through that, I thought, well, Western culture had actually solved that problem several thousand years ago by pointing out that the appropriate level of analysis is the individual, because the individual has a unique identity that is in some sense a consequence of all their multiplicitous group identities, but singularly, what would you say, singularly representative of each individual. And so then you let individuals compete and cooperate in a fair market, and that's the best possible way of moving towards the right balance between equity and wealth. There's a real attraction to a kind of deep narcissism there. And I think I first encountered that probably at Ivy League schools in the US. So I'm a Canadian and not that familiar with the more differentiated class structure in the US. And so when I went down to teach at Harvard, it was an anthropological adventure for me, as well as let's call it a research-oriented adventure and an intellectual adventure. And I didn't understand as much as I do now what dynamic the Ivy League schools played in the US in terms of ensuring upward mobility. And I knew at Harvard, I believe it was when I was there in the 90s, the estimate was that 40% of Harvard undergraduates would be billionaires by the age of 40. And that was 30 years ago. And so that was quite a substantial amount of money then. And the whole point is that if you got into an Ivy League school, as soon as you got in, you were basically a member of the 1%. Now, you might have been a junior member, but you were definitely a member. And I thought that was perfectly fine because, in some sense, because the Ivy Leagues did a damn fine job of merit-based selection. Now, it wasn't perfect. There were legacy students, for example, and there was a bit of play in the system there. But fundamentally, Harvard and the other Ivy Leagues had transformed themselves from old boys clubs in the 1960s into highly elite intellectual institutions by the 1990s.
There's a question that's often raised with the rise of the internet about whether the educational value that a university provides is really worth the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars that you need to spend to get there. But the fact is that the university system from top to bottom is still a rehash of the Prussian model of education that came about in the 18th century. And yes, that includes Ivy League universities as well, who broadly share the similar structure around syllabus, centralized teaching, grading system, and a strict hierarchy of student segments based on things like age and scores. That's why you should ask yourself just how relevant is the Prussian model of education in a world where practically no piece of information or knowledge remains exclusive to those institutes thanks to the internet? Well, besides, when you look at it that way, this entire structure and mode of education came out, you realize that it was actually a response to the labor demand that arose after the Industrial Revolution. Factories needed obedient workers who could follow time schedules and learn to complete their tasks as cost-effectively as possible. How is that conducive to a modern world that is changing as rapidly as it is today? The fact is it's not, and many students and young people today are reconsidering whether it's really worth it getting into debt and sinking 4 years into their youth to a degree. Perhaps the only real utility left in the traditional university apparatus is the fact that for at least the Ivy League universities, it is exceptionally difficult to get into them. That means the real value of their degree lies not in the education they provide, but the trust of the job market in their stringent selection process. However, we may be seeing a time when even that starts to fall off and the university system goes from being a necessity to being an option for the few. But there's also another large drawback to our education institutes that is stealing away their credibility among the younger generation, and that is the prevalence of a victim mindset and resentful ideologies I think Jordan Peterson put the finger on the problem perfectly when he said this.
Then what I saw too, and this was so interesting, was that being junior members of the 1%, with almost certain hallmark of long-term success as a consequence of Ivy League admission, wasn't enough for many students and their idiot professors. They had to have the label of oppressed working for them too. So you had this strange spectacle, as far as I was concerned, of these unbelievably fortunate Ivy League students who were offered an opportunity that, well, is really unparalleled in human history, not only benefiting as a consequence of being the beneficiaries of this amazing system, but simultaneously claiming the status of the poor and oppressed, and claiming at the same time to be avatars and representatives of that oppressed group. And I thought, Jesus, you guys, like, being rich and powerful in junior form isn't enough for you. You have to have all the virtues of the rich and all the privileges and opportunities, and you have to have all the virtues of the poor and oppressed at the same time. It's like, that just seems to me to be a bit much. And you see that reflected in the people that you're describing, who have this unbelievable wealth and opportunity, and who yet put themselves forward as, canonical victims of an oppressive system. The fact that students are now paying an insane amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to go to an Ivy League institute that is simultaneously failing to educate them, siphoning their future earnings into the pockets of greedy administrators, and ever more of them, and sabotaging their own brand simultaneously. It just looks to me like that is not a sustainable model. And you said, that you believe that the larger companies, for example, Google and other companies that are actually concerned with performance still, are going to stop regarding an Ivy League degree as a brand of capability. And so that means it'll, over a 10-year period or 15-year period, they're going to scuttle their own economic model. Maybe there's all sorts of opportunities for new education.
I think there is. I agree with you entirely. There's 650,000 fewer students in America than last year, and about 2 million fewer than 10 years ago. And I mean, they say it's demographic, but it's not demographic, because the country increases by about 2 million people per year.
Do you know why I think that is? Truth is, everyone to an extent needs a villain to blame in their life. It's the punching bag for all their problems, making them feel a convenient sense of victimhood that relieves them of their personal responsibility. Imagine how well that would scale when there's already a climate in modern American culture subsumed by the oppressor versus oppressed narrative. That's what you see on a wider scale in society as well, with everything from racial groups to economic strata held responsible for all the ills of society. In the 1%, or it's the white people, capitalism, patriarchy, where blame can be offloaded, apparently none of that blame sheds away for students even when they step foot inside the Ivy League university, which is a privilege practically no one else in the world can have, apart from a few. It's a takeover by a kind of collectivist thinking where individual responsibility hardly ever factors into the mix. Add to this the fact that the average cost of going to college is seeing an exponential rise, all the while the actual market value and need for those degrees goes down on average. It's a double inflation that is driving young people away from pursuing university degrees in droves. Here's a graph that measures the rise in the inflation of the average college tuition cost in the US compared to the Consumer Price Index. Why does college tuition seem to be so divergent relative to other sectors of the economy where prices are rising? Well, it's clear the higher education system as a whole lives in an unfairly advantaged system, helped on by student loans, creating an uncompetitive environment for universities and colleges that have plenty of students in their disposal. There will have to be a rethink about how we do modern education, how to detach education from accreditation, which is the only thing left that the universities can still clamp to provide. That's the first step that Jordan Peterson wants to take.
Here's something to think about too on the technology front. So, I spent a lot of time analyzing the relationship between psychological testing and productivity and creativity across the lifespan. And so I know a fair bit about that, I suppose. And one of the things I did learn was that part of the reason the universities have their degrees are valuable is because they were very careful in terms of meritocratic admission, and they also have a hammerlock on accreditation. And so once you have an MBA, obviously you're accredited as an MBA graduate from a given school. And that means you had a certain peer network and a certain level of intellectual proficiency even to get into the program. Certain degree of conscientiousness to rigorously pursue the program and pass it. So the value in the universities, in large part, is nested inside the accreditation. Now you could imagine, and I don't think this is technically impossible, you could imagine a system of blockchain accrediting tests that would be freely available to people. You know, I would do this on a for-profit basis, but so that if you wanted to claim Bachelor of Arts equivalence with regards to your knowledge of the humanities, that you could take a set of objective tests that couldn't be mucked about with by administrators and gain your proxy by that manner. So imagine this. It's an enterprise that I've envisioned and we're pursuing at the moment. Imagine I could produce a data set of 10,000 multiple choice questions, say in American history. And I could do that by buying multiple choice tests from high school and university professors all across the country. Okay, now we'd have to administer them to several thousand people, and then we could analyze each question with regards to its accuracy as a predictor of general knowledge domain. You can do that. You can rank order them. Then imagine you have a program that can randomly pick equivalent level of difficulty questions from that whole set of 10,000. You could set up a system that could produce random tests, so they couldn't exactly be faked or cheated easily. And you could rank order people in terms of their knowledge domains with regards to those tests, and you could blockchain it so it would be completely impenetrable to administrative interference. And you could steal the accreditation away from the universities. And I think I can't see any reason at all that that's not technically possible.
You can think about how to solve the problem of accreditation, but it's clear that there have been many attempts in the past to do this with online educational resources that provide crash courses and certifications. It remains to be seen whether Jordan Peterson does something similar with his Peterson Academy that's slated to launch soon, but I think the first step is to realize that there's a problem, which is that the overall structure of the educational system is one of the last remaining things that haven't been updated in the last few decades, even as technologies change every year. Before any solution is thought up and implemented, the individual decision rests on the young students deciding which path to choose. Is a 4-year college degree really worth the time and money it's going to take? If you're becoming a doctor, lawyer, or engineer, then probably yes, but for most other occupations, it's a choice that is starting to open up for Americans, and it's a choice that will have reverberating effects across their life.